In 1534, Thomas More is imprisoned at the Tower of London. His cell sits in one of the bleakest and darkest parts of the tower, freezing and miserable. Quite the contrast from the customary surroundings of the Lord Chancellor. He refuses to agree with Henry VIII on his break with Rome and his new marriage to Anne Boleyn. Despite prolonged imprisonment and the threat of execution, More's conscience will not budge. He might be the king's good servant, but he is God's first. And this distinction would ultimately lead to More's death and martyrdom. But why was his end so dramatic? How did he go from loyal servant to religious martyr? And who would replace him after his fall? The role of Henry VIII's chief ministers has long been debated. Men from non-aristocratic backgrounds whose rise to the highest civil role in the land would end in dramatic circumstances at the hands of a king who is often called a tyrant. Were Wolsey, More and Cromwell alike in the way they were disposed of by Henry and the machinations of court politics? How did they all climb so high? Who profited when they fell? And what impact did they have on Henry's reign and legacy? I'm Chief Historian Tracy Borman. Join me for this second episode as we chart the life and downfall of Thomas More, Henry VIII's good and loyal servant. Well, welcome to the Historic Royal Palaces podcast, and hello to anyone who is watching as well as listening. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by historian Joanne Paul. Welcome to the podcast, Joanne.
Thank you. I can say it's a genuine pleasure to be here. This is amazing.
It's quite a space, isn't it?
Oh, it's fantastic. Usually I'm just sat in my office at home.
It's quite new for us to be filming our podcast, and we thought we'd pull out all the stops. Thrones, great hall. How does it feel?
It's amazing. I love this space. It's one of the finest Tudor spaces I think that we have available to us. You can really feel it in here. You can almost feel the buzz of a Tudor banquet when you sit here, and one that Thomas More may have been at. He visited this place many times. He lived very nearby in Chelsea. And we know too that a very pivotal moment of his life took place here at Hampton Court Palace in the gallery. As he put it, Henry VIII first brake unto me of his great matter here in October of 1527. It was the first time Henry VIII told him that he was hoping to divorce Catherine of Aragon, and actually showed him in a Bible the passage of Leviticus and asked Thomas More what he thought.
Oh, what a conversation. And the ripples from that, of course, would go down the years and end in More's demise, and it all took place right here at Hampton Court, a short boat ride from More's Chelsea home. Well, Joanne, as well as being a historian, of course, you are Thomas More's biographer, so nobody is better placed to be telling us about this loyal servant, this sainted man who worked in the court of Henry VIII. Could you just very briefly tell us, before we really get into it, what was More's role, his sort of final role and title?
So he was Lord Chancellor. This was really the highest position under the king in Tudor politics. He was responsible for the conscience of the realm. He was responsible for a law court at Westminster Hall. And he was really meant to be, at least, in charge of much of the workings of government. As I'm sure we'll see, that wasn't always the case, and he ends up actually excluded from a lot of what's happening towards the end of his life and his public career.
So, Joanne, who was More? Did he come from as humble a background as the man featured in our first episode, Thomas Wolsey?
In some ways, yes, in some ways, no. It's really interesting, and my research has, I think, illuminated something that busts a bit of a myth about Thomas More. I think we see him often as having been born with a bit of a silver spoon in his mouth. And that's because we think that he was born on Milk Street in Cheapside. And there's even a plaque if you go there. That's not the case. It's true that Thomas More's father had a house in Cheapside. Thomas More later lived in Cheapside, but that was after they had sort of risen up through the ranks. Based on my research, I think he was actually born outside the London Wall in the parish of St. Giles without Cripplegate. And this makes a huge difference. Instead of growing up amongst city officials and wealthy merchants, he grew up in sort of a lawless area of stinking dishes and brothels. And it gives us, I think, a very different picture of Thomas More's upbringing and his very dramatic rise.
Yeah, absolutely. I must admit, I thought he was of a slightly more elevated status than that, but he did come from quite a legal background. His father was a lawyer, am I right?
Yeah, his father was a lawyer. He had only shortly before become a lawyer when Thomas More was born. And his father was, in fact, a baker who had died when Thomas More's father was 16. So he comes from a very sort of mixed background. It isn't this long legal lineage that I think, again, we sort of have in mind for him. His father really crawled his way up as a 16-year-old orphan baker's son to become a lawyer and then later a judge.
Okay. Tell me about Thomas More's education.
He was educated at the only free grammar school in London, which again I think tells us a little bit about his parents' station. They couldn't have afforded fees elsewhere, and that's St. Anthony's, Threadneedle Street. He did very well there, it appears, and his father's connections granted him this huge leap in his life. He ends up at Lambeth Palace in the service of the then Lord Chancellor, Cardinal Wolsey.
Is that quite a life-changing connection for More?
Absolutely it is. Thanks to Morton, he's able to secure a place at Oxford. And once he's done that, he has all sorts of connections to the scholarly world. He then pursues a career as a lawyer, has connections to the legal world, and ends up in the city as a city official as well, and has connections to the guilds, particularly the mercers.
And on the subject of connections, there's one quite dazzling sort of scholarly connection, isn't there, in the form of Erasmus.
Erasmus, yeah.
Tell me about their first meeting or how their paths crossed.
Well, they have this fascinating sort of meet-cute moment, actually, and it involves a third person who becomes very important to More, Henry. They meet in 1499. Thomas More is invited alongside Erasmus to the palace at Eltham, which is essentially like the royal nursery. Henry, who is 8 years old at the time, is there with his sisters and his younger brother, who doesn't live past infancy. He's a very precocious 8-year-old, and he demands that these scholars present him with some sort of piece of writing. Thomas More is ready with his. We don't know what it was, probably some sort of poem praising the young Prince Henry and his father, Henry VII, but Erasmus is caught out. He hasn't prepared anything.
Oops.
Yeah, indeed. It's very embarrassing for him, and he actually gets quite angry about it. And as he says, he unleashes his Spartan tongue on Thomas More as they dine. He's very upset that he's been embarrassed in this way, but they eventually become friends.
Okay. And also, I love that image of the 8-year-old Henry. Give me a present.
Absolutely.
Hand it over.
He even sends Erasmus a note as they're eating, saying, "You know, I expect something from you." I mean, it's shades of who he becomes, I think.
So an amazing sort of contact for More to have, because not only is he friends with the leading humanist in Europe, but now that's brought him into the future Henry VIII's orbit. Can you tell me a little bit more about humanism? Because it's a word that's sort of thrown around a bit, but what essentially does it boil down to?
Well, it has a lot of modern meanings, but in the Renaissance, it essentially meant a curriculum for learning that depended very much on classical texts, Greek and Roman texts of the past. And More and his circle were particularly interested in very Republican sentiments, so people like Cicero. And we'll see that come out in his later writings and even his sort of outlook on what it means to be a public servant. They really emphasized public service, civic duty. And so More always saw it as his role to be both learned, but to apply that learning to better the common good.
So he meets Henry VIII, well, the future Henry VIII, although he doesn't know at the time that he's going to be king.
Exactly,
of course,
yeah.
Henry has the older brother, Arthur, who then dies. Henry VIII does come to the throne in 1509. Has More made sure to keep in contact with him?
He's trying to. We have, again, this image of More, I think, as a sort of reluctant politician, reluctant statesman. But actually, he's ambitious, and I don't think that's a bad thing. You have to be ambitious in the Tudor period. And so when Henry VIII comes to the throne, he's there watching him parade through London on the way to his coronation, and he writes a coronation ode to Henry, praising him, talking about how this will be a golden age, and praising his wife, Catherine, who More had already admired when she had first come to London to marry Prince Arthur. And so he's trying to get in his good books very much.
Certainly his voice is the loudest when, amongst all the others, praising this kind of Adonis of a new king. And More is very quick to praise him, isn't he?
He is. It's an interesting, if you sit down with the coronation ode, though, yes, it's abounding in praise, very hyperbolic, but there are warnings in it as well. And humanists like to praise in order to set expectations, in order to guide a prince to virtuous action. And he talks about how power can corrupt even the most gifted mind. And so I think that there's some seeds of warning and caution in the coronation ode as well.
If only Henry had listened, really.
Yes, many times over.
So when does More get his reward from cultivating this young king?
So we know that Thomas More swears into Henry VIII's service in 1518. He may have been doing some work for him previously. And this really comes about because a few years earlier, he had been very successful on a diplomatic mission for Henry to the continent. And it's on that mission as well, by the way, that he produces his best-known work, Utopia. So it's a very important few months for Thomas More. And so he's sworn into Henry VIII's service. And this is the first time, he says, that as part of this swearing in, he's told to put God first, to serve the king, but to put God first. And he uses this, as we know later on, and it's even his final words, this idea of serving the king and God first.
It sounds like a great mantra to live by, but it's one to die by, actually, for More.
It's very well put. That sums it up.
Absolutely. Now, in our first episode, we talked about the first of our Thomases, Wolsey. How does More get on with this all-powerful butcher's boy in Henry's court?
Again, I'm going to myth bust a little bit. I think we have this image of Thomas More not really liking Wolsey, of finding him too corrupt. But actually, they worked together for many, many years, very closely. More's role as he comes into Henry's service really is as a go-between for Wolsey, who's very busy, largely here at Hampton Court, and Henry, who's rushing off all over the country. And so More tells Henry what the cardinal thinks about things, passes on letters and so on. And Henry sometimes listens, sometimes responds, and More goes back to the cardinal with that information. So we have a huge, huge cache of letters that More sends to Wolsey and back, because they are working together so closely throughout, from 1518 into the 1520s.
That's really interesting, because there's such a tendency to use hindsight and think, look at how they ended up, and so that they were always at loggerheads, but actually, no, that wasn't the case.
And to bring in another Thomas Cromwell, we see him always aligned with Wolsey, and of course that there's a truth to that, but Thomas More was right in that circle as well at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll go on to Cromwell. So what of More and the big man, Henry VIII, could you ever describe them as being genuine friends?
I'm not sure Henry VIII had many friends. I don't know what you think about this.
I wouldn't be his friend.
Well, and I don't think he thought anyone was good enough to be his friend. I think that implies a sense of sort of camaraderie, which means equality, and that's not that's not something he can even conceive of. And if there's anyone who's close to a friend, I think it's more people like Charles Brandon, who is at least a Duke of Suffolk, right? And who can go carousing around and hunting and jousting and all that sort of stuff. Thomas More is not that sort. No. Thomas More is a servant of the king, very much. We can tell from his letters, too, that the way that Henry thought of Thomas and treated Thomas. He was there very early in the morning with this pile of letters from Wolsey. He tells Wolsey that Henry VIII laughs him off He says, by my soul, I'll read the Remnant at night. I can't be bothered with this. So he follows him around. He moves from palace to palace. And in the evening, finally gets him again, gets him to look at a few letters. He's sent away. He's called back. He finds him in the Queen's chamber. They're chatting. And that goes on into the night. But Thomas More is not really contributing to these conversations. He's kind of just listening so that he can report back to the cardinal. So he's not this sort of bosom friends. They're not, going arm in arm in a garden discussing astronomy or anything like that. He's there to serve. And really, he's there as a sort of a representation for the cardinal. He's there almost as the cardinal's envoy to take information back to Wolsey.
That's really fascinating because so often it is presented as a friendship, but it absolutely isn't, is it?
It isn't, no.
Henry VIII is not a mere mortal, so of course he doesn't have friends. But More seems to me very cautious in that he knows what he's dealing with Henry VIII, famously referring to him as a lion. You've got to treat him with respect.
Yeah, respect and fear. He's very aware of princes, of their reputations, of the dangers of becoming a counselor to a prince. The first book of Utopia is entirely about that. It's a debate about whether it's worth it to enter the service of a prince, because at the least, you're not going to get listened to. They are going to laugh you off or just do what they were going to do anyway. And at the worst, you could risk your life, lose your head. And he knew that those were the stakes, but he did think it was worth doing anyway, because as he says in Utopia, you can try to make things just a little bit more good.
Yeah, absolutely. So to what extent did Henry and More share kind of intellectual conversation? That's often how they're presented, isn't it?
We don't really know. Certainly Henry, I'll say he fancied himself a humanist. I think you could argue that he wasn't, but he fancied himself a humanist. And certainly at the beginning of his reign was encouraged to and did support humanist scholars. And he certainly promoted them, men like Thomas More and Cuthbert Tunstall, and I could go on. Even Wolsey in some ways was a humanist. And so they probably did have conversations about these sorts of things, but we don't have any record of them. We can't be sure.
Well, one thing that obviously both men would have been very acutely aware of were these new ideas that were starting to spread across Europe, the Reformation as they came to be known. What's More's stance on this, and does he influence Henry?
Well, More's stance at the beginning is, I don't have time for this. It's really interesting, actually. The first mentions we get of Luther, of course, after 1517, More says, let someone else debate whether or not this is heresy. I'm too busy. And he was. He was extraordinarily busy. So he doesn't get into it for years, actually. It's Henry VIII who does. He writes his defense of the Seven Sacraments against Luther. More says he didn't have much of a hand in it. In fact, he says that the only thing he said was to tone down the supremacy of the Pope, because Henry and the Pope could get into a squabble later down the line, and he might not want to write that down. Unclear whether that's actually what happened. More is writing that after there is such a squabble, the break with Rome. What More does do, though, is when Luther responds, More responds to Luther. So Luther responds with this very, very, call it a vitriolic attack on Henry VIII, his against Henry, King of England. He calls him a worm. He calls him a strumpet. He says that he should have his hands and his tongue cut off and burned.
I'm loving this.
It's very, very intense. If you hate Henry and you need a sort of purge,
yes,
this is good. He calls him a fool. He calls him stupid. All of these sorts of things. And he says he doesn't have a drop of royal blood as well. So Henry doesn't take this well, as you might expect, knowing him as you do.
Yes.
But he can't stoop to responding. It's too base for him. So he asks others to do so. We don't know exactly if Henry asks More personally. Maybe Wolsey nudges him into doing it. But it does seem to be a request. And so that's More's first, but not last, foray into this polemical debate of the Reformation.
Which, of course, will just accelerate as the years go on. You said at the beginning that More's high point is being made Lord Chancellor. Tell me about that. When does that happen?
So that happens after the fall of Wolsey. Thomas More is made Lord Chancellor in his place. So this is late in 1529. More is an odd choice for Lord Chancellor. It's worth saying. Lord Chancellors had tended to be members of the clergy almost exclusively for hundreds of years. There's a few very brief exceptions. More, of course, is not that. But I think that actually is an advantage to those making that decision at that time. Wolsey had in part fallen because of this fear of clerics, this anti-clericalism, this resentment, and because he was seen to have failed in the great matter because of his allegiance to the Pope. Well, Thomas More had already shown that he was loyal to the king and kind of not so clear on his allegiance to the Pope. He was also someone who could be easily put down if he became a problem, and of course he does, and that's precisely what they decide to do. But he is an odd choice, and I think represents a real change in the office of Lord Chancellor.
It certainly does, and I think there's a certain irony as well in that he profits from Wolsey's fall, but he would kind of agree with Wolsey's stance. The great matter, this quest for an annulment from Catherine of Aragon on Henry's part, is not something that More really fully gets behind himself, is it?
Never, no, absolutely. And he is, again, a very odd choice. And I think it shows how Henry's pride really blinds him sometimes, because they have this conversation here at Hampton Court Palace in October of 1527. That's 2 years, almost exactly, before More becomes Lord Chancellor. And it's clear that More doesn't say, yes, I think you're absolutely right, you should ditch her, right? Yeah. He says that Henry takes whatever his answer is benevolently, right, which means he probably disagrees, and Henry tells him to go home and read some more, talk to some people who agree with the king. And there's a second conversation that happens just after More is appointed, where Henry says, so you went home and read, and I assume you agree with me now. Paraphrasing, of course. And More says, no. And I think Henry in this moment realizes he's just promoted someone who fundamentally disagrees with what he sees as the most important item on the agenda at the time, acquiring this divorce. And I think it stops Henry in his tracks. I don't think he's prepared for this. And More realizes that he has been maneuvered into this position to achieve this thing that he disagrees with. So a decision is made that he can continue in this position, but have nothing to do with the great matter, which effectively excludes him from most of what the machinery of government is up to at the time.
Oh. Modern day employment phrases are springing to mind. Probation period. Could have done with one of those. Constructive dismissal. He's not really being allowed to do his job properly.
I mean, I think an HR department in the Tudor court would have been a useful thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Unionise.
Unionise. But from the beginning then, More's destined to fail as Lord Chancellor. He can't really be fully effective.
Exactly, and I think we have this idea, again, as you said, as him becoming Lord Chancellor as the height of his rise, and in some ways it is, right? It's the best thing on his CV, but he's immediately in this position of limited authority. He's not getting invited to things. They hold a great council. He's not there. From really the beginning, Chapuis is really worried about him. The imperial ambassador is writing home going, he's in trouble. And I think that's true. He has a very short career as Lord Chancellor, and I think it is, as you say, doomed from the start.
And does More have anything to do directly with Anne Boleyn, who we can't avoid any longer in this conversation?
It's amazing we went this long without saying
Anne
Boleyn.
I think we've done well.
Yeah.
And of course, by now, Henry not only wants to have his marriage to Catherine annulled, he wants to marry Anne Boleyn. What does More make of that?
We don't know. He never comments on her. Later on, once they're married, he says, well, they're married. I'm not going to say anything more about it, but it went through Parliament, and so that's fine. At the time, he is clearly a proponent, an advocate, a defender of Catherine of Aragon. Chapuis tells us this, but he never says anything about Anne Boleyn specifically. More ends up actually getting himself in almost really hot water because Chapuis is such a fan of his and is writing home to Charles who of course is Catherine's nephew, saying, you know, that More is the Queen's great defender and loyal servant and everything. And Charles V writes to Thomas More, thanking him for being such a great servant of his, which, you know, it's treason, right, if he's serving the emperor and not the king. And so Chapuis has this letter and keeps trying to give it to More, and More's avoiding him, and finally confronts him and says, don't give that to me. The moment you give me that letter, I have to tell them that you've given me this letter. And I think he says it will result in an ill conversation, which is an understatement, to say the least. And he says, you know, by God, please leave me alone. And it has to sort of create this boundary because he, as he says, he's going to lose whatever power he has to advocate for the Queen if he's seen as a servant of Charles.
Of course. And just 2 years after More becomes Lord Chancellor, Catherine of Aragon is effectively banished from court. The whole thing is accelerating. So was More able to do anything as Lord Chancellor?
He was very limited. He made some inroads in terms of the law, but I think really what he was focusing on was his role as keeper of the king's conscience, which essentially meant the conscience of the realm, heresy. And so by this point, More has written a lot more about heresy, engaged in debates with heretics on the continent, and is very concerned about the spread of heresy in England. He thinks it's a contagion. He thinks it will breed violence. You know, he's looking at events on the continent like the German Peasants' War, the sack of Rome, and connecting that to Lutheran theology and doctrine. And so he's worried about this infection essentially spreading in England. So we know that he certainly advocates for the arrest and execution of heretics, and he does, in fact, hold and imprison heretics at his home in Chelsea. According to him, he entreated them in as hearty, loving a manner as he could to change their ways. Others said that he tortured them. We don't know the truth of that. He denied at the time. He writes something called the Apology of Thomas More, which is like a defense, and says that he never did anything like that. But it may have happened. But he had no power or no jurisdiction over them being condemned or executed. He just interrogated them, just interrogated them and imprisoned them for a little while before handing them over to the authorities. So again, I think we have this image of him, in fact, as lighting the pyres himself, as being involved in the execution of heretics. And that's not true. He did, though, interrogate and imprison them, and certainly was involved in hunting them down.
And what did he make of Anne Boleyn in terms of her heresy or otherwise? We know that she imported books that were actually banned. There's rumours that she read William Tyndale, a great heretic. Did More pronounce on the matter?
He didn't. He was too smart for that. You know, he was too cunning, really. He wasn't going to get involved in being that specific. But certainly what happens is he begins, as we know, in defending the king against Luther, against heresy. And the ground really does start to shift beneath his feet. So by the time that he reaches the end of the chancellorship and in his sort of retirement afterwards, he's saying the same things he always did, but they're taking on this flavor now of criticizing the king.
It's really telling from what you said that you know, this classic portrayal of More, of always speaking his mind and, you know, very, very principled. He actually tries hard not to speak his mind and to be pretty discreet because he knows the danger.
Yeah, we see him later on adopting silence as a strategy, and I think that is something we can see a little bit earlier. He's trying to walk a line. He's trying to stay in power, and we can read this cynically, or we can read it a bit more generously, because it comes back to that humanist idea of you give of public service, you perform your civic duty in order that you can make things just that little bit more good. If you can pull things just a little bit, and I think that's what Thomas More is trying to do. Again, that idea that he doesn't want to be seen very clearly as a defender of Catherine, so that he can do what he can in the room where it happens.
So, 1531, just 2 years into More's Lord Chancellorship, Catherine of Aragon is banished from court. There's a sense, really, now that things are accelerating with the break with Rome, and ultimately now we're in the territory of More's downfall, aren't we? What happens?
Well, Thomas More, again, there's a lot of suspicion on him. There's a lot of concern for him from his friends, men like Chapuis. And there's rumors that More is going to resign. He starts talking about his ill health, using that as an excuse. And so finally we get to 1532 and the submission of the clergy. And the next day, Thomas More resigns the chancellorship. And he goes to great lengths to suggest that this is because of his ill health, but the timing is very, very obvious. It's very clear he's objecting to what is becoming the royal supremacy.
And Henry accepts the resignation?
He does, generously. Again, More discusses this conversation later on and says that Henry is happy for him to go, to lead a private life. More himself says that he'll never speak on those matters to which he's objecting. And in many ways, he doesn't. He doesn't really open up about those issues until he's sentenced to die. And so he accepts that he's going to retire and live privately, and he continues to write, but about those religious matters, not about political ones.
And he tries to live a nice, quiet, uncontroversial retirement at Chelsea.
Yeah.
It doesn't quite work out.
It doesn't, no, unfortunately. In part, it's because these grounds, as I said, have shifted, and so this just religious writing is, of course, political. It can't avoid being political. I think that Henry always wants complete acquiescence. He wants complete subjection. He wants complete agreement. And Thomas More hasn't given him that. And so when Anne Boleyn becomes queen and gives birth to a daughter and the succession changes, Henry ensures through Cromwell and through Parliament that there's an oath to this new succession, which includes a preamble accepting Henry as head of the English Church. And in many ways, this is a stick to beat Thomas More with specifically. There's a number of other people as well, Fisher, of course, but Thomas More in particular. This is the third attempt really made to bring him in line, and it's the one that sticks.
Yes, the devil is in the detail, isn't it, for More? So he refuses to take the oath, and what happens?
So he's imprisoned almost immediately. It's at Lambeth Palace, actually, where he had served as a boy, that he's called up to take the oath, along with a huge number of clergymen. So he's included sort of in that category. And in fact, we don't know which oath he's offered. He may have been offered one that was more specific about the Pope than the Bishop of Rome. And Henry as head of the church. So it may have been even more than just that preamble. This whole, we think about this as very organized, and all of this is very slapdash. They're trying to put things together very quickly in order to keep Henry happy. So there are several different oaths that are offered to people, and we don't know which one he's offered. But he reads it over very carefully, reads over the act, and says, I can't do it. And so he's imprisoned very shortly after in the Tower of London, and he's there for the rest of his abridged life.
Tell me what conditions are like for More in the Tower. Where is he kept?
So we think that he's kept at the Bell Tower. That is the usual place for someone of his standing to be kept. It's a bit dark and gloomy, as he described it.
Cold as well.
Cold. He has to pay for his own imprisonment. And his wife writes letters saying, you know, I'm going into debt. I'm running out of money to give my son, because his assets have all been seized as well. So she's depending on her own monies and property to pay for her husband's imprisonment while he's there. And I think it starts kind of okay and descends. And the worst moment is when his books and papers are taken from him, because throughout his life, we just have this treasure trove of writings from him. He never stops. I always think of that line from Hamilton, why do you write like you're running out of time? That's Thomas More. Yeah. And so to take all of that away from him, he has several unfinished pieces in the Tower, I think is heartbreaking for him.
And of course, he's been writing to his beloved daughter Margaret as well throughout this time, hasn't he?
Exactly, yeah. And she's given leave to visit him even, which I think they kind of play a bit of a trick on Cromwell to make that happen. Again, we often see Margaret as trying to convince Thomas More to change his mind. Just take the oath, we all have, right? But actually, that's a performance. She writes it in a letter to him. It's not something that happens in person. Knowing Cromwell's going to read those letters, of course he is, right? He's going to read everything that comes in and out. And so this idea that maybe Margaret will convince Thomas to take the oath, oh, sure, you can go visit him then. But it's all performance.
Well, Margaret isn't the only visitor More has. Of course, Cromwell, often presented as More's nemesis, and for good reason at this stage, he comes to the Tower and he really then turns the screws. Not literally, but he's piling on the pressure, isn't he, for More to conform. Cromwell can't afford to have such a high-profile advocate for the Catholic faith, for the way things used to be. It's for his own reasons he wants More to conform.
Yeah, More is subject to several, I guess we could call them interrogations, as you say, these sort of pressure moments where he's not just asked to sign, but they try to debate him into signing it. We have records of this largely from More, but he seems to be presenting what actually happened, best we can tell. And Cromwell is very, very passionate in these meetings. He even says at one point that he'd rather his son be beheaded than Thomas More. And I think this is pressure coming from above. Yeah. We know, for instance, that Thomas Cranmer, who's of course involved in all of this as well, he's at some of these meetings as well. He writes to Cromwell saying, we could just let him swear to the succession. I think he would. If we could just take out the supremacy bit, I think we'd get a win, and we might even convince Mary to therefore sign up to it as well if Thomas More got in line. And Cromwell says that he brings this idea to the king and he basically loses it, that he's not going to have this kind of compromise because then other people will want it as well. Yeah. And he's not going to have that total compliance, which is what he's really looking for. And so Cromwell sort of loses it in turn back at Cranmer and says, no, we have to hold the line on this. The succession and supremacy have to be intertwined because they were. And so there's no compromise available to More, which is too bad because he would have sworn to the succession. As far as he was concerned, Parliament had the jurisdiction to decide the Queen and the heir. He thought that Parliament could decide a new king if it wanted to. He was that much of a sort of Republican. But he didn't think that it had the jurisdiction to separate from the wider Christendom, and he didn't think that it could make a layman head of the church. And that was the real issue for More.
So is it true that actually in the end Cromwell, his henchman Richard Rich, they got More on a technicality?
Well, yes, it's sort of, they spun a technicality. So what happens is when Rich goes in with two other men to gather up More's books and papers, he engages him in a game, essentially, for lawyers called Pudding of Cases. Apparently this is fun for lawyers. I don't know if you're a lawyer out there. maybe you find this sort of thing fun. But it's legal hypotheticals. And so he essentially says, he asks him different cases, feeling out what Thomas More thinks about issues like the Parliament making someone king, the Parliament saying God would not be God. That comes from Thomas More as a response, and so on. And at the end of this, Thomas More essentially says, Parliament cannot make the king head of the church, that is to say, Pope, which is not quite the same thing as what they've been trying to get him to say one way or the other. And in fact, Richard Rich, when he writes up this conversation, and we have this letter to Cromwell, he says at the end that Thomas More stayed silent on the matter. Cromwell, however, sees an opportunity, and all he has to do is sort of rejig two things. One, remove this context of hypotheticals, because that's not really a denial, right? They're talking in the land of sort of imagination, legal imagination. And the other is to change that last line. So that it's not specifying head of the church, that is to say Pope, but just head of the church in England. And that is the only piece of evidence that is presented at Thomas More's trial. And in fact, the two men who are in the room with them refuse to testify.
It's so unjust, as so many downfalls are in the Tudor period. I could point to Anne Boleyn, of course, who was on the opposite side to Thomas More, but was also condemned on very, very flimsy evidence.
There's a common denominator there, isn't there?
Indeed, indeed. Henry wants More gone at this stage then.
He does. And in fact, the trial means almost nothing because a week before the trial, Henry issues a writ. And in it, he condemns John Fisher, who has already been executed, tried and executed for his denial of the supremacy, which at this point is treason, thanks to Cromwell. But he includes a second name. He includes that of Thomas More, and basically says that he's a traitor, and says that anyone who defends him or colludes with him will also be punished. So the jury has no choice. And so usually in a treason trial, it takes about an hour to return a verdict. They return one in 15 minutes. They've barely had time to pop to the bathroom, right? And they're back already because they have no choice. They have to declare him guilty, even on that very single piece of flimsy evidence.
Complete foregone conclusion. More is led to his death in July 1535. Can you paint a picture of what happened?
Yeah, so the night before he writes his final letter to his family, it's a tearjerker. It's very sad. He sends his love to each member of his family, and then he says that he's actually happy, contented to die the next day because it's the eve of a celebration for St. Thomas Becket. And he's already drawing these connections which become very important after his death. The morning of his execution, he's awoken. He may have been awake anyway, praying, but someone enters his cell and tells him that he will not be allowed to give a speech. And this final, I think, removal of Thomas More's words is again very, very tragic. The night before your execution, you've probably spent a long time thinking about what it is you're going to say,
of course,
to everyone there assembled. And that's taken from him. They're worried about him rousing up the crowds. They're worried about him becoming a martyr. So he's told he's not going to be allowed to give a speech. And so he reduces his last words to those final few that we know so well. He says, "I die the king's good servant and God's first."
And that really says it all, actually. He couldn't really have encapsulated his whole life and career better than just in those few short words.
Exactly.
So this feels like a thunderbolt moment. More this great statesman, very high-profile figure. He's been beheaded. What's the impact of that?
Certainly people are appalled. I think there's real shock. Even though there had been this sense of foreboding that it might lead to this, it's still a very, very shocking moment. Chapuis says that everyone is devastated at every level of society by this. We don't know, for instance, Catherine's reaction, but she was probably devastated as well. And it really creates a martyr, which is precisely what Cranmer had warned against, what they were trying to avoid, this connection too with Thomas Becket, it's very clear. And so he becomes a figurehead, really, for Catholics in England, as he is indeed today. But he also becomes a figurehead for Protestants in a very negative way because of his involvement with the prosecution, the persecution of heretics.
Is he as disposable as other fallen ministers before him? Does Henry replace him pretty quickly?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. They were right that this lawyer from Cripplegate Without was someone they could bring down very easily. He's not got any wealth or power around him. You know, Wolsey still had quite a bit of standing when he falls and was on his way potentially back up again. More is able to be taken down completely. But because of this international reputation, not only as a statesman, but as a scholar, right? He's the man who wrote Utopia. He's built his own standing. He's built his own reputation, and in that way is almost less disposable than Wolsey. He is quickly replaced as Lord Chancellor by someone named another Thomas Audley, who's very much in Cromwell and Henry's pocket. But the position of Lord Chancellor never means again what it did under Wolsey, and what it could have meant under Thomas More had he chosen to get in line. But it's really More's chancellorship that I think, in some sense, destroys that office.
Well, it's certainly, when it comes to More, as you say, there's a huge impact immediately of his death, but it's about his afterlife, and it's a long afterlife. Famously depicted in the film A Man for All Seasons, where he is absolutely the sainted figure, the man of conscience. But then, more recent times, he's not so likeable in Wolf Hall, is he? Where do you think the real More was between those two extremes?
It's really a fascinating question, because these two presentations of More really reflect those two strains of thought about him that emerge after his death. Man for All Seasons is pulling on accounts from his own family. Of course, he was a family man. Margaret, we've already mentioned. Her husband, William Roper, writes a biography of his father-in-law, and the rest of the family really try to preserve his legacy and petition, essentially, to have him canonized as a saint. Now, that takes 400 years, but they get there eventually. And they present a picture of More that is picked up by Robert Bolt in Man for All Seasons. Now, what's interesting about that portrayal is that Bolt turns him into a defender, really, of individual conscience. Right? You know, he says, it's not because I believe it, but because I believe it. And so it's the individual against the state. Thomas More would not have gotten behind that. He actually thought that's what the Lutherans were up to, was this idea of individual conscience. But it presents this kindly, saintly, scholarly, family-oriented More. Wolf Hall, Hilary Mantel is pulling from the Protestant sources. So Fox's Book of Martyrs, for instance, which of course is hugely popular under Elizabeth, presents More as this heretic hunter, which in some ways, as we've said, is also true. Which is the real More? Well, in a sense, neither and both, right? Both are adding aspects of him that make arguments about their own times. You know, Bolt wanted someone who was defending individual conscience. Mantel wanted someone who really showed the dark side of religious zealotry. But both are also drawing on sources that come from the 16th century that present sides of More, present things he actually did, things he actually said. So he's a very complex man who's neither hero nor villain.
Yeah, and yet history always tries to make you one or the other. So you've really made it clear that there's a lot more nuance in this man. He's a complex character. But what do you make of him and his legacy?
I think for me, what fascinates me most about him is Thomas More as a scholar. Like I said, he's these vast volumes of his writing. I have read them all a few times. And he really exhibits some very complex political thought, as well as some very straightforward ideas. One of the most fundamental contributions that I think he makes in his own time is his education of his daughters. We have this letter that he writes, again, with the idea that it might be more publicly consumed, I think, to his children's tutor, defending the idea that he should educate the daughters alongside the son, that women are equally able to reason, that they're equally able to engage with these texts. And his daughters actually become these examples for Henry's court and beyond of what educating women can look like. They dispute before the king. People write home about, oh my God, can you believe it? These women were disputing, it was amazing. And Erasmus talks about how that influences courtiers in the court of Charles V as well, that they kind of go, oh, maybe I could educate my daughters, you know, that sounds okay. Now, there were limitations to this. Thomas More thought that it was to make them better wives and mothers, and he thought that that was their role. But he did think that they should be educated. And there's this great letter that he writes to his eldest daughter, Margaret, on the eve of her wedding, saying that I don't think any man could teach you anything about erudition. And although I think that you in all things should bow to the authority and knowledge of your husband, I think you could probably teach him a thing or two about astronomy. and it's just brilliant. I mean, he really believes in their capability, and he makes other people believe it too.
That was the thing that resonated for me most, reading your biography of More, and just how far ahead of his time he was in terms of the education of his daughters and the position of women in general. I think, you know, regardless of any other part of his legacy, you really have to admire him for that.
And it pays off. It's his daughters who really preserve his legacy. And not just his daughters, he had sort of, we might think of them as wards or adopted daughters as well. And they're the ones who preserve his papers, who give us the information that allow us to write a biography of him today.
Joanne, it's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for the throne. I'll be taking this home with me. Yeah.
It's pretty good. I could get used to it myself.
Yeah, sit here, write a book in it.
Exactly. Well, do let us know if you've enjoyed this episode by leaving us a comment or a review. And don't forget to subscribe on your podcast app or on YouTube. Well, tune in next time when I'll be in the hot seat, actually. I'll be spending time with my personal favourite of the Thomases, Henry VIII's right-hand man, of course, Thomas Cromwell. Until then, thanks for joining us, loyal listeners.